Rome, summer of 1940. The marble of the fascist palaces reflects the Mediterranean sun with an almost blinding intensity. On the avenues redesigned by Mussolini, battalions marched beneath triumphal arches that evoked an ancient empire, a lost glory that the Deuce had promised to restore. The crowds cheered, the flags trembled in the breeze, and in that moment of collective euphoria, when France was falling and Germany seemed invincible, few Italians imagined that their country was already walking toward the abyss. Even fewer knew that, locked in a safe in the Palazzo Venezia, there was a document that should never have existed. A report prepared by economists, generals and advisors loyal to Mussolini, but brutally honest in its conclusions. A report that the Duke read once, stored in absolute secrecy, and never mentioned to the Führer. Because that document contained an unbearable truth: Italy could not win the war. It had no resources, no industry, no time, and Mussolini knew this from the beginning. The story the world knows is simple. In 1943, after consecutive military disasters, Italy switched sides and betrayed Germany. But this narrative hides layers of lies, fear, wounded pride, and above all, a secret buried in the shadows of the fascist regime. The true betrayal did not begin in 1943. It began much earlier, at the exact moment when Mussolini decided to hide from Hitler the catastrophic reality of the Italian war machine. This is the account of that secret document and of the truth it contained. Let us go back to June of 1940. France is surrendering. Hitler strolls through the empty streets of Paris like a conquering tourist, and Mussolini, watching from Rome, feels a desperate urgency not to be left out of history. Italy enters the war against a dying France, seeking a slice of glory without having fired a decisive shot. It is an opportunistic entrance, and everyone knows it. But inside the offices of the regime, where black uniforms contrast with the paleness of worried faces, some men already understood the magnitude of the error. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, chief of the General Staff, urged caution. The numbers did not add up. Italy possessed a large army on paper, but one profoundly outdated. Tanks that broke down on irregular terrain. Aircraft too slow for modern aerial combat. Impressive warships, but lacking fuel and radar. And most critical of all, an economy that could barely feed its own population. Mussolini commissioned the report in secret. He needed to know the truth, even if he could not admit it publicly. Engineers, industrial economists, logistics officers, and military strategists gathered. They worked for weeks in isolated rooms, compiling data on steel production, oil reserves, manufacturing capacity, availability of coal, stocks of aluminum and rubber. They compared Italian numbers with German, British, and American figures. And when they finished, the document had 200 pages of graphs, tables, and irrefutable conclusions. Italy was decades behind industrially. It could not sustain a prolonged war, and if the United States entered the conflict, as the report anticipated, defeat would be inevitable and crushing. Mussolini read the report on a July night, alone in his office. The windows were open, but no breeze relieved the suffocating heat. He spent hours over those pages, the lamplight casting long shadows on the walls decorated with maps of the ancient Roman Empire. What did he feel in that moment? Perhaps despair, perhaps anger at himself, perhaps the temptation to burn everything and pretend it had never existed. But the Duke was, above all, a man of theatre. He had built his political career on the projection of strength, on the illusion of greatness, and now, committed to Hitler, allied with the most powerful regime in Europe, he could not retreat. He could not admit weakness, so he made the fatal decision. He hid the report. He ordered that only 3 copies be made, all stored in different safes, and never, in any of his meetings with Hitler, did he mention those numbers. Instead, he continued speaking of millions of soldiers ready for combat, of a navy dominating the Mediterranean, of an aeronautical industry capable of competing with any world power. Lies that Hitler wanted to believe. and that the Italians would pay for with blood. The first signs of disaster appeared quickly. In October of 1940, Mussolini invaded Greece, expecting a quick victory that would impress Hitler and restore his credibility. But the Greeks resisted fiercely. The Italian army, poorly equipped and poorly coordinated, was pushed back into Albania in the brutal winter of the Greek mountains. Italian soldiers froze in summer uniforms. Artillery got stuck in muddy roads, supplies did not arrive, and casualties accumulated while snow covered the bodies abandoned in the ravines. It was a public humiliation, and worse, it forced Hitler to divert German troops to save his incompetent ally, delaying Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, a chain of consequences that perhaps changed the course of the war. In North Africa, the pattern repeated itself. Italian forces in Libya, technically superior in numbers to the British, were crushed in weeks during Operation Compass. Thousands of Italian soldiers surrendered without significant resistance, marching in endless columns through the desert while their rusted weapons were abandoned in the sand. Italian tanks, designed for parades in Rome, broke down under the African heat. Ammunition was scarce, food was rationed to the extreme, and the soldiers, many of them peasants from southern Italy, who had never seen the sea before being sent to die in foreign lands, began to question why they were fighting. Rome sent Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to stabilize the front. Again, Germany saving Italy. And again, Mussolini remained silent about the true causes of the Italian military collapse. Hitler began to suspect. In general staff meetings, he made acid comments about Italian unreliability. German officers serving alongside the Italians sent devastating reports about disorganization, lack of morale, and equipment inferiority. But Hitler, bound by diplomatic considerations and the need to keep the Axis coalition united, never confronted Mussolini directly, and the Duce, aware that his position depended on the illusion of strength, continued hiding the truth. Meanwhile, the secret report remained locked away, a paper ghost haunting the corridors of fascist power. The Italian generals knew, Badoglio knew, King Victor Emmanuel III, a shadowy and silent figure in the Quirinal Palace, also knew, and slowly, discreetly, they began to prepare for the inevitable, not through open action, but through whispered conversations in private rooms, contacts maintained with neutral diplomats, contingency plans drawn up in secret. The Italian elite understood that Mussolini had thrown them into a war they could not win, and that, when the right moment came, they would have to abandon the Duce and seek peace with the Allies, not out of nobility or sense of justice, but out of pure survival. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 deepened the crisis. Mussolini, again seeking relevance alongside Hitler, sent the CSIR, the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, to fight on the Eastern Front. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers marched eastward, equipped with boots that could not withstand the cold, obsolete armaments, and horses instead of trucks. They were positioned in vulnerable sectors of the German lines, considered less critical. And when the Soviet winter counteroffensive crushed Axis positions, it was the Italians who suffered the worst proportional losses. Entire divisions were annihilated. Soldiers froze alive in the trenches, and those who survived the retreat returned home as ghosts, their empty eyes reflecting horrors they could never describe. In Rome, reality began to infiltrate the consciousness even of the most fanatical fascists. Allied bombing raids on Italian cities destroyed factories, killed civilians, and exposed the impotence of Italian air defense. The population, which had once acclaimed the Duce in the squares, now murmured in the shadows about hunger, deaths, and the senselessness of the war. The black market flourished. Bread disappeared from bakeries, and in the endless lines for food, Italian women, whose sons died in African deserts and Russian steppes, began to ask aloud, why? Why are we in this war? What have we gained from it? Mussolini aged years in months. His health deteriorated. Stomach ulcers tormented him. chronic insomnia left his dark circles ever deeper. He who had been Italy's strongman, the charismatic leader who promised to restore Roman glory, now hid in his office, avoiding public appearances, communicating through intermediaries. And every night, perhaps, he thought about that report, about those pages that had predicted everything, that had warned that this moment would come, and that he had chosen to ignore. July of 1943, the Allies land in Sicily. Italian resistance is pathetic. Entire cities surrender without fighting. Italian soldiers abandon their weapons and return home. The Sicilian population, tired of war and fascism, welcomes the Americans as liberators. And in Rome, in the Grand Council of Fascism, the men who supported Mussolini for 2 decades finally find the courage to betray him. They vote for his removal. The Duce, the one who threatened entire nations, is brought down by an internal vote of his own party. The king orders his arrest. And in an ironic twist of history, Mussolini, who hid the truth from Hitler, is now hidden from the Führer in a secret prison in the mountains. But the betrayal was not yet complete. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Badoglio, initiates secret negotiations with the Allies. Officially, they declare they will continue fighting alongside Germany, but behind the scenes, they prepare surrender. It is a delicate and dangerous dance, Hitler suspects. German troops begin to position themselves strategically in Italy, ready to occupy the country if the Italians switch sides. And in September of 1943, when the Italian armistice with the Allies is finally announced, Germany reacts with brutal speed. Within hours, German soldiers disarm entire Italian divisions. Italian officers who resist are summarily executed. And Italy, from ally to enemy in the blink of an eye, plunges into a devastating civil war. The secret document, that report Mussolini had hidden, finally sees the light. Not because he decided to reveal it, but because in the confusion of the regime's fall, the archives are looted. Allied officers find the report and immediately understand its importance. Here was the proof. Mussolini knew since 1940 that Italy could not win. He knew he was leading his country to disaster, and he chose to lie to Hitler, lie to his people, and continue the war anyway. Not out of strategy, not out of ideology, but out of pride, out of fear of losing power, out of an inability to admit error. Hitler, when he finally learned of the report's existence through intelligence channels, felt a cold, calculated rage. He realized he had been deceived, that he had based part of his Mediterranean strategy on the premise that Italy was a reliable and capable ally. And that Mussolini, that man he considered his ideological equal, his partner in building a new European order, had been a fraud from the beginning. The Italian betrayal was not just a change of military alliance. It was the revelation that the Axis partnership had been built on lies and illusions from the start. The Italian population paid the price. The north of the country became a war zone among Germans, fascists loyal to Mussolini, and Italian partisans allied with the Allies. Cities were bombed repeatedly. Massacres of civilians became common. Hunger reached critical levels, and while Rome was declared an open city to avoid destruction, the rest of Italy bled. Families divided ideologically. Brothers fought on opposite sides, and every day bodies appeared hanging in public squares, with signs identifying them as traitors, regardless of which side had executed them. Mussolini, rescued by German commandos from prison in a spectacular operation, was installed as puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic in the north. But he was a pathetic shadow of the man he had been. His regime controlled little, depended totally on the Germans, and was hated by most Italians. He spent his days at his residence on Lake Garda, dictating memoirs no one would read, receiving reports of defeats he could not reverse, and perhaps, in moments of absolute solitude, when the distant sounds of artillery echoed over the calm waters of the lake, he thought again about that report, about those pages that predicted everything, and about the choice he had made to ignore them. The final months of the war in Italy were a prolonged agony. The Allies advanced slowly through mountainous terrain, facing fierce resistance from German troops who transformed each hill into a fortress. Historic cities were destroyed. Monte Cassino, with its medieval abbey, was reduced to rubble. Florence lost ancient bridges, and in each liberated village, inhabitants emerged from basements and shelters, thin, traumatized, barely able to believe that the war had finally passed them by. But in the south, in Rome and Naples, life slowly returned. People cleaned rubble, markets reopened, and slowly, painfully, they began to confront the question everyone avoided. How did we allow this to happen? The answer lay, in part, in that report. Italy had entered the war without conditions to win it, and when this became evident, instead of seeking an exit, Mussolini chose illusion. He chose to hide the truth, intensify propaganda, send more men to die on impossible fronts, and the generals, the industrialists, the bureaucrats who knew the reality, chose complicit silence, protecting their positions, hoping to survive. Italy's betrayal of Germany in 1943 was not an act of moral courage. It was an act of pragmatic desperation, a belated attempt to save what could be saved of a country shattered by catastrophic choices. April of 1945, German troops in Italy finally surrender. Mussolini, attempting to flee to Switzerland disguised as a German soldier, is captured by Italian communist partisans, summarily executed along with his mistress Claretta Petacci. Their bodies are taken to Milan and hung upside down at a gas station in Piazzale Loreto, exposed to the crowd that insults and assaults them. It is a grotesque end for the man who dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire. And in the weeks that follow, as Italy tries to process the trauma of the last 5 years, that secret report circulates among historians, journalists, and politicians. It becomes evidence in trials, it is cited in speeches, and it transforms into a symbol of the futility and lie that sustained Italian fascism. Hitler, in his final days in his bunker in Berlin, surrounded by the Soviet advance, bitterly reflected on his allies. Italy had betrayed him. Romania had switched sides. Hungary had tried to negotiate a separate peace, and he, the man who promised 1,000 years of Reich, was about to commit suicide in the ruins of his capital. But among all the betrayals, the Italian one hurt in a particular way, because it had been based on lies from the beginning. Because Mussolini, his supposed ideological brother, had consciously deceived him, and because the Axis, that alliance that promised to reshape the world, revealed itself to be a fragile construction, sustained by inflated egos and false information. Mussolini's secret report became, in the following decades, an object of intense study. Historians analyzed it to understand not only Italian military weakness, but the inner workings of totalitarian regimes, how autocratic leaders, isolated in bubbles of propaganda and adulation, lose touch with reality, how the suppression of negative information creates vicious cycles of catastrophic decisions, and how personal pride and fear of losing power can lead entire nations to ruin. The document was clinically precise in its predictions. It had correctly calculated that Italy could not sustain more than 2 years of war on multiple fronts. It had predicted that American entry would guarantee Axis defeat. It had even estimated, with a surprisingly small margin of error, the number of Italian casualties that would occur. But perhaps the most disturbing section of the report was its political conclusion. The authors, pragmatic economists and strategists, had written clearly, if Italy entered this war, it would eventually have to betray Germany to survive, not as a moral option, but as an inevitable strategic necessity. Mussolini had read this, he had understood this, and he completely ignored it, believing perhaps that his willpower, his charisma, his political genius could somehow overcome the laws of economics and industrial logistics. It was the ultimate arrogance, and it cost Italy hundreds of thousands of dead, destroyed cities, a collapsed economy, and a national wound that would take generations to heal. In the post-war decades, Italy rebuilt. The Marshall Plan brought American capital. Industry was modernized. Cities were erected again. And gradually the memory of the war was processed, reinterpreted, sometimes romanticized. The Italian resistance, the partisans who fought against Germans and fascists, became national heroes, and rightly so. But the broader narrative about Italian betrayal was too complex for simple slogans. Italy had not switched sides out of virtue. It switched out of necessity, too late, after causing immense suffering to itself and others. And Mussolini's secret report, now stored in official archives, remained as silent witness that all of this could have been avoided. There is a photograph taken in June of 1940, a few days after Italy entered the war. It shows Mussolini on a balcony of the Palazzo Venezia, delivering a speech to an enormous crowd in the square below. His chin is raised. His uniform is impeccable. The masses acclaim him with outstretched arms. And if we look carefully at his face in the photograph, we can see something in his eyes. It is not confidence. It is not conviction. It is poorly disguised fear, because in that moment, he already knew. The report was already in his safe. The numbers had already spoken, and he was leading his country toward an abyss he could not avoid, simply because he could not admit he had made a mistake. History frequently teaches us through disasters, and the Italian betrayal of Germany, seen through the lens of that secret report, teaches devastatingly relevant lessons about the danger of leaders who suppress inconvenient truths, about the cost of decisions made by pride instead of reason, about how alliances based on propaganda and illusion crumble when confronted with the brutal reality of modern war, and about how entire nations can be dragged into avoidable tragedies by men incapable of saying one simple but impossible word: I was wrong. When the last Italian veterans of World War II were interviewed decades later, many expressed complex feelings about the betrayal of 1943. Some defended it as necessary and just. Others saw it as cowardly and dishonorable. But almost all agreed on one point. They had been betrayed first. Betrayed by a leader who sent them to fight knowing they could not win. Betrayed by a regime that hid the truth and fed them lies. And when Italy finally switched sides, it was not betraying Germany. It was trying, desperately and belatedly, to escape the greater betrayal that Mussolini had committed against his own people. The Mediterranean sun still shines over Rome. The palaces still stand imposing. The ruins of the Roman Empire still attract millions of visitors. But in the shadows of government buildings, in the dusty archives where yellowed documents rest in catalogued boxes, that report remains. 200 pages of inconvenient truth, of numbers that do not lie, of predictions that were fulfilled with terrible precision. It is a paper monument to the futility of arrogance, a testament about the price of pride, and a warning whispered through the decades: when leaders choose illusion over reality, when truth is hidden to preserve power, when personal egos supersede the good of the nation, the result is always the same. Not glory, not greatness, only ash, blood, and the bitter irony of betrayals that were inevitable from the beginning. The truth about why Italy betrayed Germany is not in the secret negotiations of 1943. It lies in that moment in July of 1940, when Mussolini closed the report, locked it in the safe, and decided to pretend that reality did not exist. Everything that came after was merely consequence. The betrayal was not a sudden act of moral weakness. It was the logical and predictable outcome of a fundamental lie. And when we look today at that photograph of Mussolini on the balcony, delivering speeches to crowds who still believed in him, we can finally see what his eyes tried to hide. It was not strength, it was terror. The terror of a man who knew the truth, chose to ignore it, and condemned an entire nation to pay for his cowardice with years of unimaginable suffering. The silence after the last artillery, the snow covering the abandoned battlefields, and in the hands of an archivist in some basement in Rome, 200 yellowed pages that should never have been necessary, because the truth was there from the beginning, just waiting for someone to have the courage to accept it. But the story does not end with Mussolini's death or with the revelation of the report. It ends with the questions that remain decades later, echoing through generations who never knew the war but carry its scars. How could an entire nation be led to the abyss by a single man? How could millions of Italians, intelligent and capable people, allow this to happen? And more disturbingly, could it happen again? The Italian soldiers who returned from Russia, those who survived the hellish retreat through the frozen steppes, brought with them more than physical wounds. They brought the visceral understanding that they had been sent to die in a war their leaders knew was impossible to win. In the following decades, many of them refused to speak about the experience. They kept silence at family dinners when someone mentioned the war. They woke in the middle of the night with screams trapped in their throats, reliving the sound of Soviet artillery crushing their poorly defended positions. And when finally some broke the silence, their stories revealed not just the horror of war, but the specific betrayal of having been used as disposable pieces in a political game that Mussolini already knew was lost. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, described the moment when his unit received orders to defend a position on the bank of the Don River with inadequate equipment against Soviet tanks. "We knew we were going to die," he said, his voice still carrying resentment 4 decades later. Not for glory, not for defense of the homeland, but because someone in Rome decided we needed to be there to impress the Germans. We were living propaganda, and when the Russians attacked, we discovered that our anti-tank weapons barely functioned in the extreme cold. Half of my division froze or was massacred in 3 days. And during all that time, Mussolini knew. The report had already calculated exactly this. He knew we did not have equipment for that climate, that we did not have logistics to sustain operations in the east, that we were cannon fodder being sacrificed to maintain an alliance with Hitler. And even so, he sent us there. In Libya, the situation was no different. Italian officers who served in the North African desert reported how they fought with miserable rations, insufficient water, and rationed ammunition, while watching relatively well-supplied German units of the Afrika Korps. The humiliation was constant. German jokes about Italian incompetence circulated openly, and the Italian soldiers, many of them brave and dedicated men, understood that it was not their fault. It was the systemic failure of a regime that had sent them into combat, knowing it did not have industrial capacity to sustain them. Mussolini's report had documented precisely this. Italy produced less than 1/10 of the steel that Britain did, had oil reserves for less than 6 months of intensive war, and its armaments production capacity was decades behind other powers. But these men in the desert did not have access to the report. They only knew that their weapons failed, their tanks broke down, and their food did not arrive. Italian families who lost sons, husbands, and fathers in the war faced, in the post-war period, an impossible question to answer. Why? Why did my son die on a Greek beach? Why did my husband freeze in Russia? Why was my father killed in an Allied bombing defending northern Italy for a German occupation regime? And when the report finally became public, when the details of its existence were revealed in newspapers and history books, the anger was immense. Mussolini had not only betrayed them by sending them into an impossible war, he had betrayed them consciously, with full knowledge that they were doomed from the beginning. This transformed the national narrative. Italy was not an innocent victim dragged by Germany into war. It was a victim of its own leader, who chose pride over responsibility, illusion over reality, and personal power over the welfare of his nation. Hitler, in his final days in the Berlin bunker, surrounded by maps showing a collapsing Reich, reportedly muttered repeatedly about Italy. Witnesses reported that he referred to the Italian betrayal as the beginning of the end, the first domino to fall that would eventually condemn the entire Axis alliance. But what Hitler never fully understood was the extent of Mussolini's lie. He suspected Italian weakness, yes. He despised Italian military incompetence, certainly, but he never comprehended that since 1940, from the initial moment of the effective war alliance, Mussolini operated with secret knowledge that the partnership was founded on quicksand. The Führer, himself a master of propaganda and manipulation of truth, had been deceived by a partner who had learned from him the very techniques of mass illusion. It was a bitter irony that probably never fully penetrated Hitler's consciousness as he prepared his suicide in the smoking ruins of his capital. The reconstruction of Italy in the post-war period was, in many respects, an attempt to rebuild not just buildings and infrastructure, but the national psyche itself. The country needed to process the collective trauma of having been led to ruin by avoidable choices. It needed to confront the question of complicity. How many Italians supported Mussolini enthusiastically? How many remained silent when they could have resisted? And how does a society move forward carrying this weight? The secret report became a central part of this process of historical confrontation. It was tangible evidence that Italian tragedy was not inevitable accident, but the result of conscious decisions made by a specific man at specific moments. This offered, paradoxically, some comfort. If ruin was caused by flawed human choices, then successful reconstruction could result from wise human choices. Democratic Italy of the post-war period defined itself in explicit opposition to fascism, and the report served as a constant reminder of the dangers of autocratic leaders operating without oversight or transparency. In Italian schools of the following decades, the report entered history curricula. Students read excerpts from it, analyzed its industrial production graphs, debated why Mussolini chose to ignore it. Generations of young Italians learned the fundamental lesson. Political systems that allow a single individual to suppress truth and make decisions without accountability inevitably lead to catastrophe. The Italian betrayal of Germany, recontextualized through the lens of the report, transformed from national embarrassment into moral lesson about the importance of transparency, democracy, and the courage to confront uncomfortable realities. It was not the change of alliance that mattered, but what it revealed about governance, responsibility, and the human cost of arrogance in power. And then there is the question of the Germans who served in Italy and witnessed firsthand the disintegration of the alliance. Wehrmacht soldiers who fought alongside Italians reported contradictory experiences. Some spoke with contempt of Italian incompetence. Others, more thoughtful, acknowledged that individual Italian soldiers often showed courage but were sabotaged by terrible leadership and inadequate equipment. One German officer, in memoirs published in the 1950s, wrote, "We despised them, but perhaps we should have envied their wisdom. They realized before us that the war was lost and acted accordingly. We Germans fought to the bitter end, destroying our own country in the process. Perhaps the true betrayal was not the Italian one, but the blind German loyalty to a cause already doomed." It was a provocative observation that suggested the Italian betrayal, far from being a cowardly act, could be interpreted as painful but necessary pragmatism, a belated attempt to limit damage that was already catastrophic. The Vatican, located in the heart of Rome, maintained throughout the war a complex and frequently ambiguous position. Pope Pius XII avoided explicit condemnation of the Axis, seeking to keep the Church officially neutral, though clearly concerned with the direction of the war. When Italy switched sides in 1943, the Vatican found itself in an extremely delicate position, surrounded by German forces occupying Rome. Documents from Vatican archives suggest that church leaders had knowledge, through confessionals and informal networks, of the growing disillusionment among Italian military and civilians. It is possible that information about Mussolini's secret report, or at least rumors of its existence, reached the Vatican through these networks. If so, the Church chose not to intervene publicly, a decision that remains controversial decades later. But Vatican silence mirrored on a smaller scale the silence of so many Italians who knew parts of the truth but lacked the power or courage to act upon it. When modern historians examine the report today, using contemporary analytical methodologies, they are impressed by its precision. The economic projections were correct within minimal margins of error. The predictions about the duration of war that Italy could sustain were frighteningly accurate, and the scenarios about American entry and inevitable Axis defeat revealed sophisticated strategic understanding. This raises a disturbing question. If analysts working for Mussolini in 1940 could predict the course of the war with such precision, why could Axis leaders like Hitler and Mussolini himself not? The answer, historians suggest, lies not in lack of information or analytical capacity, but in the psychology of authoritarian leadership. Leaders who build regimes around personality cults and narratives of invincibility become psychologically incapable of processing information that contradicts that narrative. Mussolini could not accept the report because doing so would destroy the foundation of his power. Hitler could not accept deteriorating military reality because that would unravel the mystique of the infallible Führer. Both were trapped in snares of their own ideological creations, unable to see reality even when it was presented clearly before them. The final irony of the story is that the report, hidden to protect Mussolini, eventually became the most damning evidence against him. If he had simply never commissioned the document, he could argue in the post-war period that he entered the war through ignorance or honest error of judgment. But the existence of the report proved that he knew everything, and he consciously chose to lead Italy to disaster anyway. That choice, documented in 200 pages of sober analysis, transformed Mussolini in history from tragic figure to simply malignant one. Not a man victim of circumstances or deceived by advisors, but a leader who possessed the truth and rejected it out of pride and fear of losing power. And so, decades after the last shots, the echo of that report continues to reverberate. In every nation that faces a decision about going to war, in every leader tempted to suppress inconvenient information, in every citizen deciding whether to remain silent or demand truth from their rulers. The secret report that Mussolini hid from Hitler became, ironically, one of the most public and powerful historical lessons of the 20th century. And its message remains urgently relevant. When leaders choose illusion over reality, when truth is hidden to preserve image, when personal pride supersedes national responsibility, the result is not the glory they sought, but the ruin they feared. The Italian betrayal of Germany was not the problem. The true betrayal was Mussolini's to his own people, beginning in that moment in July of 1940, when he closed that report, locked the truth in a safe, and decided that his ambition was worth more than the lives of hundreds of thousands of Italians who would die in the following years because of his lie. If this hidden truth shocked you, you're not ready for what we're uncovering next. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because the next documentary exposes a secret that changed World War II forever, and only 3% of history enthusiasts know about it. Don't be left behind when everyone's talking about it. Like this video if Mussolini's betrayal stunned you, and comment below which leader's secret we should expose next: Churchill, Stalin, or Roosevelt. Share this with someone who needs to know the truth. New episodes drop every week, revealing the classified documents they tried to bury. Join our community of history truth seekers before this channel gets shadow banned. The clock is ticking. History waits for no one.